you basically can forget all other videos on my channel, because this is probably the most important video that was always missing on my channel, and it just came to me like 2 weeks ago to actually make this video. So here is the ultimate size guide for a fitting kimono. In case you're here for the first time, my name is Matsunaga and I'm a fully trained and certified kimono teacher and stylist. This video will show you how to measure, calculate your kimono size. So it doesn't matter if you want to make a kimono or if you want to buy a second-hand or a new kimono. This is how you can figure out your own size and make sure that the kimono you're about to make or to buy is actually fitting you. I will go over men's and of course women's kimono. I will also tell you a fitting size for an undergarment as well as kimono coats. But first of all, I will have to make one thing clear, and that is there is no free size in kimono, and I still find listings online where they tell you a kimono would be free size. I think that every plus size friend of mine can actually confirm that free size is the biggest lie in fashion industry, and honestly for me it just feels like the meanest way of the fashion industry trying to tell plus size people to lose weight. Let's just stop talking about it, it makes me so angry. So why do you actually need a kimono in your size? I mean, it's just a wrap dress, right? Not really, because where the seams sit and where seams meet is actually very important, and that is your size. So you need a size so actually the kimono sits or wraps or drapes well around your body. Especially when we talk about men's kimono are shorter than women's kimono. I'm gonna get to it later. But when they don't really have your length, it's like wearing too long or way too short trousers. And of course, when you have a kimono in your size, you struggle way less when you put it on. Suddenly everything sits as it should sit, and that is actually quite addictive. I can tell you, a kimono in your size just... I stopped buying kimono that are not even close to my size a long time ago. The good thing about kimono, and I talked about that in my video, we have to talk about plus size in kimono video, is that a kimono is put on as a wrap dress, so it's draped when you put it on, which means you have a buffer here and there of plus minus centimeter you can add or subtract from your actual measurement and still work with that kimono. No worry, I'm gonna mention that buffer after every measurement calculations. I'm already getting confused. So what measurements will you need to actually be able to wear a kimono? So a kimono consists of 6 panels, and those 6 panels all together have a length that cover your body up from shoulder to feet. And then of course you need those 6 panels, actually 4, we're going to talk about it later, wide enough to cover up your hip circumference. And then you also need, of course, a sleeve length to actually cover up your arms too. So those are the measurements you basically need. Plus you need a very specific and important measurement that makes the dressing process smoother. And of course, I'm gonna cover that one in this video too. What measurements will not be in this video? I will not talk about set measurements. For example, the collar width, because that is a set measurement when making kimono, and in my kimono sewing videos I always tell you how to make the collar and how wide to make the collar. But this video is also for people who just want to look for a kimono online second-hand that fits them. So the collar width doesn't change according to the silhouette, so it's basically always the same, so it doesn't really matter. But again, I always mention it in my sewing video, so when you want to make a kimono, you're definitely not gonna missing that measurement out. I'm also not gonna talk about obi in this video because there are reasons. You will get them in the end of this video. So let's get started with the easiest measurement, which is the length of the kimono. Where we're gonna start with women's kimono. And I'm gonna call it women's kimono because I have to distinguish. If you don't identify as a woman, no one says you can't wear that, okay? But the sizing of it is different than a men's kimono, and I would just use those words to distinguish. I don't know how often I have already said that on my channel. A women's kimono has to be as long as you are tall, and I mean your total height. The reason for that is that the women's kimono in the mid 18th century became super long and was dragged over the floor when walking inside the house. When you went outside, you of course would hold the kimono up, and they also started to tie the kimono up over the obi with a so-called kakae obi. In the end of the 19th century, women started to tie up the kimono before putting on the obi itself with the first tie and fold the kimono over it to hide that tie. And in the end, what turned out is the so-called ohashuri, the fold in the lower waist or in the hip area of the kimono on back and front. A ohashuri looks best when the kimono actually has your height as length, because then you have a really properly sized ohashuri. I am very often asked how long the ohashuri actually has to be. It basically depends on your body silhouette, because the ultimate goal of kimono is actually show everyone having the same silhouette, and you have to play around a lot with proportions to actually get that. But most of the time, as I said, when the kimono has your body height as length, the ohashuri usually turns out quite great. That is also why the length of a kimono for women is called mitake, which basically means body length, while the men's kimono length, nochmal, wir brauchen zwei Genitive, while the men's kimono's length is called kitake, which you could translate with wear length. If you want to have a better translation, I would call it garment length. So you can tell those have two different names, which means they're differently long or differently measured. A kitake, a men's kimono's length, has to be as long as you actually need it when you put it on, which means it's measured from your shoulder to your ankle on the back. And you could also calculate that with your height minus 26 or 27 centimeter. But I honestly do recommend to measure it, because usually measuring gives the better outcomes than calculating. I have made a kimono for my husband in the very beginning as a present. It was actually a yukata, and we calculated the length. And because my husband has a very long neck and not so long legs, it doesn't really fit. It's a tiny bit too long. So definitely measuring better than calculating always. Lastly, the buffer of this, because women's kimono are supposed to be a tiny bit longer and then folded up, you have a buffer of plus minus 5 centimeter you can play with, and actually even shorter depending how good you're with dressing tricks. And yeah, one day I will make a video about that too. For men, unfortunately, there is no buffer at all. The kimono has to have that size to really make it fit and not making look like you have a way too short or a way too long garment. Next is the length of the sleeve. And I think length of sleeve is like the worst word ever, because in kimono we have two lengths of the sleeve, which is first of all the horizontal length, that is usually referred to as yuki in Japanese, and they have a vertical length. But I want to start with the yuki, the horizontal length. The yuki also better measure than calculated, so I'm going to tell you how to measure it. You start in the center of your neck and then you measure the way down to your ankle. And according to where you live in Japan, your arm is either in a 90-degree angle to your body or in a 45-degree angle to your body. I learned in a 45-degree angle, which actually already gives you different lengths of yuki. Here is the thing. In history, yuki wasn't that important anyway. For daily wardrobe, yuki were way shorter than they are today. And for formal wardrobe, the yuki was a tiny bit longer. Very simple reasons. In your daily life, a long yuki, I swear the kimono ends up everywhere, whatever you're doing, because you still have the vertical length of the sleeve that is also adding to all of this. So I personally have usually a yuki 7 centimeters shorter than my actual yuki is, but I do recommend to have a formal kimono in your actual yuki so you can go to formal events without being kimono policed. So that is also your buffer. Find your comfort zone. How long do you think a yuki can be so it still looks good on you and properly proportioned on you? And because a yuki is measured the same for men's kimono too, for all of those of you out there who want to have a men's kimono, just find your comfort zone, what still looks good on you, what you feel comfortable with. Again, in history, for daily wear, the vertical length of the sleeve, the so-called sodetake, was actually shorter, and for formal wear, again, it was longer. So when you buy second-hand kimono, you will find various sleeve lengths out there on a kimono. When you want to make a kimono and you want to have it super proportioned, usually you would take 1/3 of your height as kimono sleeve length. But the longest for casual wear that I know is actually 53 centimeters. So you can see with vertical sleeve length, sodetake, you have the most freedom of playing around with. So let's talk about the width of the kimono. And no worries, this time I'm gonna break it down super nicely for you. I have many regrets that I have just slapped it into the how to make a kimono the easy way video, because obviously people find it very confusing. So a kimono is made of 6 panels, I said, but when you put on a kimono, you actually cover up 2 of the panels on the front, which means you need actually 4 panels to cover up your whole hip circumference. And the width of those 4 panels is expressed in 2 measurements, the front width and the back width. We're gonna start with the front width. For the front width, you need just 1 measurement, and that is the distance of your 2 front hip bones from left to right. And you give it a tiny bit of a buffer, so you give it plus 1 centimeter. And this is the width you need to cover up your front. So these are your front panels. And I said panels because when you look at the front, you can see that the front of a kimono consists of 2 panels, a narrow panel that is called okumi and another wider panel. And the okumi panel width is actually set. It's 15 centimeter or about 15 centimeter. So you need that measurement alpha minus 15 centimeter to get the so-called front width. The front width is in Japanese called maehaba, and because I wanted to avoid too many Japanese vocabularies in that one video, I called it measurement B. Anyway, we're gonna use alpha again to also get the back width. When you have the front width already covered up, you have to figure out what is the rest of your hip you have to cover up with the back panels. So what you do is you take your hip circumference minus your measurement alpha, and because you have 2 back panels, you have to divide that in 2 to get your back width, the ushiro haba. And because it is divided into this back width, oshiro haba, or I call the measurement A in that one video, that size is actually just the size of 1 panel on the back from side seam to center back seam. Again, those measurements are the same for men's and women's kimono, so you just measure and calculate the exact same thing. Just definitely make sure to actually measure the widest point of your hip, as you usually do when you are into making clothing or tailoring. You usually always measure the widest point of your hip. When we talk about buffer, there's actually a lot of buffer there. I personally can go up to -1 centimeter of all of those measurements, and I can still put on the kimono perfectly on me. But that is also because I have a lot of practice with dressing myself in too small kimono. When you're just starting off with kimono, I actually recommend to really try to find a kimono who has all of those sizes to make you get used to the dressing process. And after that, you can experiment a tiny bit with different sizes. Last but not least is the very important measurement that I talked about in the beginning of this video, the one that makes the dressing process smoother. That measurement is called erishita, or it has another name, tsumashita. That erishita is a distance from the end of the collar to the bottom corner of your kimono. And average of this is actually half of your height. So when you find a kimono that has your length, it usually has the collar somewhere at that area. The reason why you need it somewhere in that area is because you always want to tuck the end of the collar under the tie. So you need the collar long enough so you can set it under the tie. This goes more into kimono making because usually kimono sellers don't list the erishita length. Also keep in mind that depending on how you dress yourself and where you like to place your tie and many other reasons, you would make this a tiny bit shorter or longer. So this again is just basically a lot of experimenting in the future and find out what you find fitting better. So that were the most important measurements you need when you want to make or buy a kimono. And keep in mind that those kimono measurements are the basic measurements for everything in kimono. Those measurements is what you start to calculate off your fitting undergarment or a haori. So those are measurements you want to keep by hand. I have a picture of my measurements in my phone, so as soon as I want to purchase a new kimono or when I make a new kimono, I always have those measurements by hand. So we're gonna take those measurements and I'm gonna show you how to calculate a fitting undergarment measurements with that. Pulling out my script because this is basically just reading off. So I'm also gonna put the formulas of this on screen. So an undergarment for you is again your height minus 30 centimeter. But I personally hate minus 30 centimeter because those nagajuban really, they drag on the floor when I walk, and I have one in my size and the hem is already completely damaged. Do not recommend. So my personal preference of my juban is minus 33 to minus 35 centimeter. At least they should probably touch the end of my tabi. So you can see length of a juban is again just personal preference. The next measurement is your so-called yuki, the horizontal length of the sleeve, and that has to be your kimono yuki minus 8 millimeter. And it's, by the way, very important where you take those 8 millimeter off, because a yuki actually consists of two sizes, which is one, the width of your shoulder, the kata haba, and the width of the sleeve, the sode haba. And you have to take 4 millimeters of each to make the juban actually fit your kimono, because a woman's kimono has actually open sleeve onto the side that is closer to your body. So this is where your juban can actually slip out. Or when it's too long, it will look out of the opening of the sleeve at your ankles. Both of them just doesn't look good. So keep in mind to take off 4 millimeter of shoulder width and sleeve width to actually make that juban fitting to that kimono. The vertical length of the sleeve, the so-called sodetake, has to be kimono sodetake minus 8 millimeter. The back width of a juban has to be wider than the kimono. It is the kimono back width plus 1 to 2 centimeter. And the front width has to be even wider. It's kimono front width plus 3 to 4 centimeter. And I already can tell that you hate this. It's something centimeter to something centimeter. It just shows that it's preference. If you like it a tiny bit tighter or a tiny bit wider. When we talk about nagajuban and you're a kimono beginner and you're just starting off with your kimono journey, I do recommend to make everything a tiny bit wider than too narrow, because more fabric is always better than less. So let's talk about men's kimonos, undergarments. The length of a men's kimono undergarment has to be the kitake, the kimono length, minus 2 to 4 centimeter. You can see a lot of preference here too, if you like it shorter rather than longer, or if you like it rather longer. It's absolutely up to you. The yuki for a men's undergarment or juban has to be the kimono yuki minus 1 centimeter to 1.5 centimeter. And you can see, oh yeah, men do have so much freedom there because of the construction of the kimono, because the sleeves are actually closed, completely closed on one side. It does not matter that much. And the vertical length of the sleeve has to be, again, 8 millimeters shorter. For the back width, it's the same as women's juban, so you have your kimono back width plus 1 to 2 centimeter. For the front width, you actually go really big with men, so you usually do the front width plus 4 centimeter. But again, I would say this is according to your preference and dressing style. So you really have to keep in mind that those measurements very often talk about a preference, because again, a kimono is something you drape around you when you dress yourself. So the way how you dress yourself and how you put the kimono on changes a lot also in your kimono journey, and what your preference is depends not only on your silhouette, also just on how efficient you can put on a kimono, or on how well you can work with bigger or too small kimono, or even juban. I think also a big problem is when you collect a lot of second-hand kimono like I do, and you sew here and there actually kimono in your actual size. You need actually an undergarment that fits not really you, but actually fits that kimono too. So I have a range of nagajuban. I actually have, I think, 12 to 14 different nagajuban that fit different kimono sizes, and according to every kimono, I choose a different nagajuban. So when you want to have juban that actually fit the kimono, it's very important that you can actually measure the kimono right. So I'm gonna take a few seconds and tell you how to actually measure the kimono you have at home, and then either use those measurements to calculate for juban or later a haori that actually fits to it, or just if you want to make sure if that kimono actually fits your measurements. We're gonna start with the length of the kimono on the front. You start measuring at the so-called katayama, the part where the kimono is folded over for front and back. And you measure down along the side seam to the bottom hem. The next measurement on the front is the front width. You always measure this on the bottom hem. You put your measure onto the okumi seam, the place where the okumi is sewed on, and you measure then to your side seam. The next measurement is taken on the back. It's the so-called yuki. You put your measure onto the center back seam and measure all the way to the sleeve opening. Last but not least, the back width. The back width is also always taken on the bottom hem of the kimono. You put your measure onto the center back seam and you measure to your side seam. So you can use those measurements and calculate with the calculations I have showed you earlier to find actually a matching undergarment to that kimono. Front and back width, by the way, is not so important when we talk about undergarments, but the yuki and the soretake should actually be matching. The same goes for kimono coats. And lastly, I want to talk about how to calculate your kimono coat size from a kimono size or your own kimono measurements. So a haori length has to be your kitake, again kimono length, minus 50 centimeter. The yuki, or the horizontal length of the sleeve, has to be the kimono yuki plus 4 to 8 millimeter. And this time it's very important again where you add those 4 to 8 millimeter. Make sure to add those only to the sleeve width, because the width of the shoulder, the kata haba, actually has to match up with the kimono to make it actually sit nice. For men, the vertical sleeve length, or the so-called sodetake, is in average the same length as the kimono. It also can be a tiny bit shorter, but yes, average same length. For haori, actually only the back width matters because the front width is open anyway, and the back width for men has to be kimono back width plus 4 millimeter. Really had to look that one up. Only 4 millimeter. Oh my gosh. So that is it, what you need to calculate the size of a haori. Now for women's kimono. They're a tiny bit different. Let's start again with the length for a women's haori. And usually they say the length of a haori should be half of your body height. And I can only say no. Because the length of a haori actually depends on what was in trend, or what is in trend right now. Because pre-war they had these huge haoris that were really long. They were up to a meter or meter and 10. They're called nagajuban, long haori. And after the war, especially in the 60s, 70s, up to 80s, you see those really short haori that barely cover up the bum. That was in trend at that time. And nowadays we're back at longer, because the antique kimono dressing style, the pre-war dressing style, is really in trend right now. So especially when you have a lot of kimono from different decades, like I have pre-war haori and I have after-war haori, and I also have haori made to my own size. I have so many different lengths of them that it doesn't really matter how long it is. The yuki of a women's haori has to be like a men's haori. It's the kimono yuki plus 4 to 8 millimeter. Again, adding that width only to the sleeve width, not to the shoulder width, because shoulder width has to actually match up with the kimono. Vertical sleeve length for women's kimono is actually really interesting, because it's the kimono sleeve length minus 2 centimeter. And I really hope some of you were like, what? Minus 2 centimeter? Why actually make it shorter, not longer, when you have to cover it actually up? It is because you have this huge kimono obi on the back, and you actually also tuck a lot of fabric into the obi, and you need minus 2 centimeter of the sodetake to actually even that out. So keep in mind, usually it's your kimono sleeve length, the sodetake, minus 2 centimeter for haori. And because men's kimono wear a completely different obi, they just don't have the problem. Lastly, the back width of a women's haori has to match up with the back width of the kimono. Last but not least, why do I not talk about obi in this video? First of all, because there are categories for obis. They usually are about the same width and always are about the same length, but still are somehow not. It depends on how you want to tie that obi, like talking about the arrangement, the knot specifically. How many ways do you know to tie no taiko? Because there are ways you can work with shorter obi, and there are ways you need actually a long obi that it will go the exact way you want to have it. It also depends on how efficient you actually can tie an obi. How many fabric do you actually lose because you tie it too loose around your waist? So I would actually love to take this topic about fitting obi, especially the topic about plus size obi, and bring this into another separate video, so I don't just have to again slap it into this video and people are just gonna be confused by it. So I can also show you how to, for example, remake an already existing obi. How was it done actually? How is it done actually in Japan, in history and today, to actually make obi longer. So if you don't want to miss that video and you haven't subscribed yet, and you also want to learn more from a professional kimono teacher, make sure to subscribe. I would be really happy to have you here. I hope I could enlighten you a tiny bit more. If you have any more questions, leave them down below in the comments or message me on Instagram, and I'll talk to you in my next video. Bye!